Many of us have always wondered what would happen if a certain player won an MVP or won more MVPs. Guys like Jerry West and Kawhi Leonard, who were all once close enough to win one, while there are guys like Michael Jordan and LeBron James who probably deserve more than what they currently have. However, one of the biggest names that always seems to slip past us is that of Chris Paul. To the many of you who are unaware of just how dominant this man once was, who would question my sanity right now, thinking Chris Paul was never an MVP candidate. The simple fact is, Chris Paul was more than just a multi-time MVP candidate, he was once robbed of one. In 2008, the NBA concluded the regular season by awarding Kobe Bryant his first and only MVP. The Los Angeles Laker guard was one of those borderline MVPs who never got his due, but in 2008, he was finally awarded the MVP he so deserved. Unfortunately, it wasn't given to the one who truly deserved it that season, and in today's video, we'll have a look at 3 reasons why Chris Paul deserved the 2007-08 NBA Most Valuable Player of the Year award over Kobe Bryant. One of the biggest determining factors for the MVP are stats. Not only did Chris Paul lead Kobe Bryant and the league in some basic stats, but he also beat Kobe Bryant in practically every single advanced and value metric, where he also led the league in some as well. The point is, CP3 absolutely dominated Kobe Bryant statistically. Statistics are almost the basis of an MVP. Stats show contributions and impact. The better your stats, the more impact and value you should have. In this case, it shouldn't have been any different. Let's have a look at Kobe Bryant's basic stats from the season. I'll also show off where he ranked in terms of the league for these statistics. Kobe Bryant averaged 28.3 points, 6.3 rebounds, 5.4 assists, 1.8 steals, and half a block while shooting 45.9% from the field, 36.1% from 3, and 84% from the line. As you can tell, these are some extraordinary numbers. They're MVP type numbers without a question. Finishing second in scoring is always a great way of proving your worth on the offensive side of the ball, something Kobe had pretty much cemented at that point. Plus, adding about 6 rebounds and 5 assists shows an all-around effort that only MVPs display. On the defensive side, Kobe was one of the best at his position. Being a top 10 steals leader also helps your case for one of the most important defenders on your team automatically, and his block average was tied for the 5th highest of his career, so pretty solid. Efficiency-wise, it wasn't the most outstanding display of efficiency, but then again, Kobe Bryant was a volume scorer who never shot better than 47% for his entire career, so going by Kobe standards, it was an average year from the field and from 3. Overall, this was an exceptional season for any player, but for Kobe Bryant standards, it could have been top 5, which speaks to his greatness, but it doesn't guarantee or justify the MVP just like that. Kobe Bryant's magnificent display on offense made him a fan favorite and an inspiration. By the 2007-08 season, Kobe was already one of the league's top players and a crowd favorite. He entertained people while also competing for a championship every single year he could. His incredible display of skills on both ends made him look the part for an MVP caliber player. Then you add his stats, it's an MVP season without a question, but it isn't better than Chris Paul's season. Let's now have a look at Chris Paul's regular season basic statistics. Chris Paul averaged 21.1 points, 4 rebounds, 11.6 assists, 2.7 steals, and 0.1 block a game, while also shooting 48.8% from the field, 36.9% from 3, and 85.1% from the line. I think the stats speak for themselves. Forget the fact that he averaged better than 20 points per game on 49% shooting, but he also led the league in assists, and that's just on offense. Defensively, he grabbed 4 boards while being a 6-foot point guard and led the league in steals with almost 3 steals a game. Absolutely astonishing. CP3 was a small package of explosive talent. Paul is truly underrated, not just as an all-time great, but as a skillful basketball player. There have been very few unathletic point guards who were capable of averaging these types of numbers. Granted, Chris Paul wasn't completely unathletic because he could certainly get up, but compared to the modern day point guard and even some past greats, Paul certainly wasn't the most athletically gifted, but that didn't stop him from taking over the league with his exceptional play on both sides. These stats prove the craftiness and high basketball IQ that Chris Paul possessed, and still possesses. He was capable of averaging 20, he just decided playmaking was more important over time, but at his peak, as he was right here, Paul could do both with ease, and it's proven now. His effectiveness as a defender, while being undersized, has always been something to admire. His league-leading steals average prove his defensive smarts, and later on, you'll truly understand how great of a defender he actually was. Efficiency-wise, we can already confirm that Chris Paul shot a higher percentage from the field than Kobe by about 2%, while attempting 4 less shots per game. And in both 3-point field goal percentages and free throw percentages, Chris Paul also beat Kobe in those departments. But for now, let's save that for a straight up comparison. As for Chris Paul, he put on a statistical virtuoso in this season and should have been awarded for his efforts. Now that we know both players' basic stats, let's put them together and compare them. Here's a look at the stats side by side. First, let's have a look at the scoring column. By now, all of you should have already established psychologically the difference between Kobe Bryant's offense and Chris Paul's offense. Kobe was a scorer, while Chris Paul was a playmaker, so the fact that Kobe leads Paul by 7 points makes all the sense in the world, and the points should be awarded to him. But I would have to say it's like comparing apples to oranges here. Looking at total rebounds, we see that a 6'6" Kobe Bryant averaged about 2 more rebounds than a 6' Chris Paul. Let's be fair here. Kobe only averaged about 2 more rebounds than Paul while being a whole half foot taller than him. Still, the point should be given to him. But again, it practically holds no weight considering the height difference and the actual lack of discrepancy between the two averages. At the assist column, it makes sense that Chris Paul leads Kobe Bryant in that department, but what makes this such a heavy point in Paul's favor is that not only does he lead Kobe in assists by nearly 6 assists, but he leads the whole NBA in assists with nearly 12 assists per game. Just for some context, the last time up to that point that someone averaged more than 11.6 assists was John Stockton when he averaged 12.3 assists back in the 1994-95 NBA season, more than a decade ago. So Chris Paul was doing something pretty legendary with his averages. This should be considered a heavy win in Chris Paul's favor. For the steals category, Chris Paul led Kobe Bryant and the league. It's also a pretty comfortable lead since Chris Paul led the league while Kobe Bryant wasn't even top 5. Now on to the blocks column. Both weren't great rim protectors, but both are justified, so it's not an issue. Looking at efficiency numbers, Chris Paul leads Kobe Bryant in all 3 of them. He led Kobe in field goal percentage while attempting 4 less shots, in 3-point field goal percentage while attempting 2 less threes, and in free throw percentage while attempting almost 4 less free throws. The differences aren't that significant, but Paul does hold the advantage in all 3 categories, so he takes them. Now as we look at it all together, we can see that Chris Paul beat Kobe in 5 out of the 8 basic stats, while Kobe obviously took the remaining 3. To sum it up, the basic stats tell us that Chris Paul was a better player statistically. However, basic stats have been proven to be deceiving. This is why most analysts would much rather take a look at advanced statistics. Just to give you all a heads up, Kobe may have had a chance in the basic stats category against Chris Paul, but when it comes to the advanced metrics, there is no argument. Chris Paul was the MVP. First, let's have a look at Kobe's advanced metrics. Kobe Bryant had a PER of 24.2, an offensive win share of 9.5, defensive win share of 4.3, an overall win share of 13.8. His win share per 48 was .208. His offensive box plus minus was 5.2, and his defensive box plus minus was 0.6. His overall box plus minus was 5.8, and lastly, his value over replacement player was 6.3. Based on where he ranked in the league for most of the important categories, it's fair to say Kobe Bryant had a solid year. He never dipped too low and was always among the league's best players. However, his actual numbers aren't very productive, particularly his PER. Usually, MVPs have a PER in the very high 20s or even early 30s. Kobe's didn't even crack halfway. No matter, Chris Paul's advanced metrics couldn't have been any better, right? Chris Paul had a PER of 28.3, an offensive win shares rating of 13.2, a defensive win shares rating of 4.6, an overall win share rating of 17.8, a win share per 48 of .284, an offensive box plus minus of 7.2, a defensive box plus minus of 3.2, and an overall box plus minus of 10.4, as well as a value over replacement player of 9.3. These are some absolutely sensational numbers. Not only does this PER meet the average PER of an MVP, but it ranks in the top tier of MVP winners. In fact, Chris Paul's PER was vastly greater than the average at the time. The average PER for the last 5 MVP winners before 2008 was 25.8. Paul's PER was well above that mark. As for the rest of his numbers, you can clearly see how spectacular they are based on where he ranks in each of them. He finished practically second in every important metric and even led in some as well. These numbers are tremendous and a far cry from the MVP numbers for sure. Now, Let's put both of them together and compare them head to head. Here's a look at their stats side by side. It's truly amazing to see this comparison. It still genuinely bothers me that the MVP was given to someone other than Chris Paul that year, but the past is the past. Looking at the PER, while Kobe displayed a high-end all-star level PER, Chris Paul gave us one of the best PERs of the last 5 years and the numerical value of a true MVP. Looking at his win shares and win shares per 48, we can see a massive gap between Chris Paul and Kobe Bryant. Not only did Chris Paul leave Kobe in the dirt in this metric, he also left second place in the dirt as well. He led second place, LeBron James, by 2.6, which is almost the combined difference from 9th place to 2nd place, that being 2.3. While Chris Paul finished first in win shares per 48, Kobe Bryant sat 7 spots behind him and exactly 0.067% behind as well. But once we get to the real value ruler here, that being the box plus minus, we can see the gap widen. Chris Paul sat 5 spots ahead of Kobe Bryant and also led him by 4.6, which is the equivalent to the box plus minus score of Jose Calderon, who finished in 12th in box plus minus that year. The last important value metric to me is the value over a replacement player, where Chris Paul devastated Kobe Bryant there too. While the rankings indicate that Kobe was right on Chris Paul's tail, nothing could have been further from the truth. While Kobe Bryant finished 3rd behind Chris Paul's 2nd in value over replacement player, Paul led Kobe in 3 whole points. Just to show you how big of a gap that is, while CP3 leads 3rd place by 3 points, the player who Kobe Bryant beats by 3 whole points was Jason Terry, who finished 30th in VORP that year. Just think about that for a second. Up or down, side to side, in or out, it doesn't matter how you look at it. Chris Paul absolutely obliterated Kobe Bryant in the advanced metrics, and that's been proven. We don't even have to go over the defensive metrics where Chris Paul also holds a significant advantage over Kobe Bryant as well. As you've seen throughout this entire video, the statistics crowned a different champion than the NBA crowned. Whatever stat you want to bring up, the common denominator is that Chris Paul is over Kobe Bryant, and that's it. Every important stat used to determine the MVP's points to Chris Paul being the much better and more impactful basketball player. The stats are a flat-out overwhelming favor for Chris Paul. Statistically, it's just been proven, Chris Paul deserved the MVP. Now let's have a look at another aspect that led to Kobe Bryant stealing Chris Paul's MVP, the regular season success of both teams. I know that was a lot of numbers talk and some of it may have gone over your head, but now we'll move on to something that's much more simpler to understand. Probably the most important factor in determining the MVP of the season is the player's team record. The literal name of the MVP is the most valuable player, with valuable being the most important word. How is one deemed valuable in basketball? Is it by the impact you have on helping your team win basketball games? I made an entire video about this and I'll link it up in the top right corner if you want to have a look at that after this video. Anyways, by now the stats have shown us that Chris Paul was the most valuable player, but now we need to take a look at the team's record to justify that claim and actually give the argument some validity. First up, we'll be having a look at Kobe Bryant and his Los Angeles Lakers. From 2000 to 2002, the LA Lakers were back-to-back champions. They remained the final team to three-peat and they were a dominant force in the early 2000s. However, by 2006, the team was already out missing the playoffs or getting dismissed in the first round, all while Kobe Bryant was leading them. While Kobe was having some MVP-worthy seasons throughout those times, his team weren't exactly performing, and that's probably why he was never awarded the MVP before. By the 2007-8 season, however, the Lakers started turning things around and Kobe began to embrace his teammates a lot more. By the beginning of February, the Lakers had acquired all-star Pau Gasol to the mix. Aside from Pau Gasol and Kobe Bryant, the Lakers weren't a very deep team. Their next best players were Derek Fisher, Lamar Odom, and Andrew Bynum. After that, it was a series of no-names and guys like Luke Walton and a third-year Trevor Ariza. It was a very top-heavy team and a great starting lineup at best. The addition of Pau Gasol is what helped propel this team to make the playoffs, but before Gasol, it was Kobe Bryant who had to put them in that position. Throughout the whole year, the Lakers never really seemed to struggle with Kobe Bryant there. Kobe played all 82 games that year and led the Lakers to a 57-25 record, the best in the Western Conference. This was a much better showing than the previous year, where they won just 42 games and were out in 5 in the first round. It was a significant improvement, but they also had better players as well, which does matter. Kobe averaged 32 points in 2007 and they still won 42 games, so the team clearly got better and that's why they won 57 games. Kobe certainly had something to do with it, but it's not like he did something special that actually made a 15-game difference. It was a team effort and that should definitely be noted. As for Chris Paul and his New Orleans Hornets, some of you may assume the reason Chris Paul ultimately didn't receive the MVP was because he had a subpar record that was below 50 games. Let me provide you with some backstory though. The New Orleans Hornets made their NBA debut during the 2002-2003 season, just 2 years before Chris Paul was drafted. The first few years for the franchise were a struggle, but they managed. Before the 2007-8 season, the Hornets had made the playoffs 2 times and even won 47 games in their first NBA season. Once Paul was taken 4th overall in the 2005 NBA draft, the expectations for him to perform were high. In his first 2 seasons he couldn't quite deliver, but he was still adjusting so there's no harm no foul. Then, in his 3rd year, he does this. His best teammates from the 2007-8 season were Tyson Chandler, David West, and Peja Stojakovic. Both West and Stojakovic were practically in their primes, and they were absolutely dominant figures. David West was a walking double-double, Peja Stojakovic was an absolute flamethrower and a lights-out shooter, and Tyson Chandler was a powerful defensive anchor and presence in the post that served Paul's alley-oop partner all those years. Those were Chris Paul's legitimate helpful teammates throughout that whole year and guys he trusted. That group was what made up the New Orleans Hornets, a surprise that season because no one expected them to do what they did. With Chris Paul, this team climbed to new heights and to heights that they had never reached yet. The New Orleans Hornets, led by Chris Paul, after being slated to win just 38 games, finished with a record of 56-26 for the year, the second best record in the Western Conference. They absolutely left the basketball world in shock. The Hornets finished winning 19 more games than expected, and 17 more games than the previous season. This was the definition of a surprise, as no one saw it coming. While the Lakers were slated to win 43 games, the Hornets made a bigger rise and defied all the odds more than any other team in the league. With a top-heavy team of their own, led by a 6-foot-tall point guard, the Hornets finished 1 game shy of the number 1 seed in their conference. What makes this better is that the Hornets have yet to win more than 56 games since the 2008 season and have never won more than 47 prior to the 2008 season, so that 2007-8 season with MVP Chris Paul remains the Hornets/Pelicans' greatest winning season in franchise history. This all trumps the 1-game difference between New Orleans and Los Angeles. Kobe Bryant wins 1 more game but dramatically loses statistically and still gets MVP? It doesn't make any sense to me. 1 game doesn't cover up the massive gap between Chris Paul and Kobe Bryant that season. The team records were practically identical and so were the teams themselves. While I would say Kobe Bryant had more help because his team was more experienced and had better players, they were still a top-heavy team in the Western Conference, and yet, Chris Paul missed by 1 game. The team record and teams themselves, plus the stats, only help Chris Paul's case for the MVP, and a 1-game argument won't get too far. Now we get to the final part of the argument. For most people, narratives hold no weight in the MVP discussion, or at least they shouldn't. However, I'm one that does believe that narrative does in fact hold some weight and is a very powerful factor in determining the league MVP. There was definitely a case to be made for narratives on both sides of the case, both for Kobe Bryant and Chris Paul. We'll have a look at Kobe Bryant's first. By 2008, Kobe Bryant hadn't won a single MVP award, even though he came very close to doing so in 2005 and 2006. He was basically 30 years old in 2008 and was seemingly running out of runway. His teams were horrible, missing the playoffs or getting bounced out early, and no superstar seemed to want to take on the challenge of playing alongside Kobe, so a championship season was unlikely at that point. He had always been one of the league's best players and someone who entertained thousands, if not millions of people around the world. He was an icon and someone missing the one trophy every other all-time great had, an MVP. With his age and injury concerns, any chances of giving him an MVP, the NBA had to seize it so that one of their most profitable and marketable superstars and all-time greats finally got what they didn't have. Kobe did surprise many people, exceeding many expectations, and improved on his own game and his team's performance for the past 3 years. He made them a contender again, with the help of a better roster, and that's why he got the MVP consideration. This was a significant narrative, one that many people can buy into, particularly the media. In the simplest terms, Kobe Bryant hadn't won an MVP up until that point. He was getting old, and it was time to give him an MVP before he retired. That was the narrative for Kobe Bryant's MVP. It couldn't have been the injuries and how he came back from them, because in 2007, Kobe Bryant played 77 games, with the only 2 missed games being suspensions. It couldn't have been that he missed the playoffs, because he made them in 2007, where he was eliminated in 5 games in the first round. It couldn't have been because his team managed to spring back from a below 500 record to a 57-25 record, because the Lakers did win 42 games in 2007. In other words, the narrative is the lack of an MVP, nothing else. There is no other strong narrative that is worthy of an MVP. On the other hand, Chris Paul had his own narratives to share. Chris Paul was a third-year player playing like a superstar. He took a new franchise to their greatest peak of 56 wins after only winning 39 games the previous year, a below 500 record. He led the league in 2 basic categories and in 3 advanced metrics while only being 22 years old, 6 feet tall, on a top-heavy team where his third best teammate was Tyson Chandler. He was a little guy who could do big things that season, who almost surpassed the Los Angeles Lakers as the first seed. He played 80 games that year, and in those 80 games, he crafted the greatest season the New Orleans Hornets ever had and will ever see. After being slated to win 37 games, Chris Paul led the Hornets to a 56-26 record to earn the second best record in the Western Conference. With everyone counting him and his team out, he showed up and showed out, delivering one of the greatest surprise seasons in NBA history. Not only that, but Chris Paul and his Hornets were able to do all of this while the city was recovering from a devastating Hurricane Katrina. The city was in shambles, and yet the team outplayed and stunned everyone on the basketball court, and did all this for the people of Louisiana who were struggling to get back on their feet. Winning an MVP during these difficult circumstances is by far the greatest narrative in the NBA, and one that should have won the MVP. If you compare Chris Paul's narrative to Kobe Bryant's narrative, it looks like Chris Paul's narrative is much stronger than Kobe's. One just doesn't have an MVP, while the other had an MVP season with all odds stacked against him and his team. Even the narrative can't protect Kobe Bryant here. Chris Paul should have had the better story and the more important story, because it's one of resolve and resilience, something Kobe Bryant has struggled with for 3 years up until that point, since he could never do with the Lakers what Chris Paul did with the Hornets. Not only do the stats support Chris Paul, but the narrative is also in Chris Paul's favor, which should have made this a runaway win, and yet, that's not what happened at all. We can find that Chris Paul really did get robbed of the MVP in 2008. First, the stats were overwhelmingly in his favor. Then we saw that the team record wasn't that different at all. And then we come to the narrative, where Chris Paul has the better story. The 2008 MVP race should have been a runaway for Chris Paul, but even if it did go to Kobe, you'd expect it to be a lot closer, right? Actually, it seemed as if it was a runaway for Kobe. Here are the votes for the MVP race of that year. Kobe Bryant finished with 54 more first place votes than Chris Paul. This gap is almost as large as the gap between Kobe Bryant's stats and Chris Paul's stats. The people who voted for the MVP that year, I'd have to say, got it all wrong. I have no problem with Kobe Bryant or the season that he had, but it simply wasn't better than the one that Chris Paul had. Sure, it would have looked really bad if Kobe Bryant hadn't won an MVP there and would retire without an MVP, but it's all about being fair. Kobe Bryant had a sensational season with great numbers across the board, but we can't just discount and dismiss that Chris Paul had a better season all around. Paul dominated Kobe Bryant in almost every statistical category and held advantages in other key points. He was by far the better player, the most important player, with the most storied season, which should have made him the most valuable player of the 2007-8 NBA season. And that just about does it. I'm sorry I've been away for a while, but this video has been a really difficult one to make. And with all that finally out of the way, as always, until next time, cheers.